What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over input buffers and command buffers. They're the same thing, just labeled differently, but basically what they are is they're a sequence of inputs that get stored. So whenever you press buttons on your controller or on your keyboard, your inputs get stored into some sort of buffer, which is your container. In our case, it's going to be a T-array. And basically, you're going to scan the array for a sequence of inputs that is known by the game. And say this certain sequence is this attack, like this Hadouken, or this, super move that I can do, this grapple that I can do, whatever. Basically, it just looks for a certain set of inputs in a sequence, so right in a row, and potentially within a certain amount of frames. So we're also going to be keeping a timestamp. And then you're going to perform the action if that sequence is found. So this is episode 1. This is probably going to be about 3 episodes. Episode 1, today's episode, we're going to be covering how to capture our inputs and remove them from the buffer when necessary. We will be going over how to actually find a sequence and then use that to perform an action in episode 2. And then in episode 3, we will most likely make it so we can visualize the input buffer, just like in a practice mode when you're pressing all the buttons on your controller and you can see them all popping up on the screen. We're going to do that. That way you don't have to just look at logs all day like we're going to be doing today. And then I'll also show you a new stage that my friend Shadow Magnus made for us. So we have a wonderful new stage here. Don't mind the camera. I zoomed in a little bit, but didn't adjust the field of view. I'm trying to play around with the feel of the game. I think I like the look of this a little bit more. It still needs some work, but yeah. Anyway, so Shadow Magnus made this amazing level for us. It is not entirely finished yet. He has told me there's still some work to be done on it, but it is looking so good, and now we can actually use a map that doesn't just look like pink and green colors, so that's awesome. Alright guys, so let's get into it. In the top left hand corner over here, you will be able to see inputs being listed to the screen as I press them. We can determine exactly what our input buffer is, how long these items stay in the input buffer, and things like that. So when I press a key, and I've already pressed a bunch, so let's restart. Let's start from the beginning so it doesn't get too confusing. Because right now we just have the log, we don't have any visualization. Now, it said I pressed left mouse button because I clicked on the window. Don't worry, we will adjust that stuff, although we'll probably factor out any buttons that aren't going to be used. We're probably going to factor in only buttons that are used by our individual players. For the time being, I'm not doing that, I'm just looking for any key, just to kind of make this process as simple as possible. So, okay, I haven't pressed any keys other than left mouse button. Now, I'm going to press the D key. You can see D gets added to the input buffer, and then it fades away. It doesn't mean it's gone yet. I just made the print string go away. So they stay in the buffer for 10 seconds, which is longer than you'd want, but I'm exaggerating for the case of this tutorial. So if I wait my 10 seconds, and I actually don't know how long it's been, but if I press another key like G, you can see the D key is no longer in the buffer. So I'm printing out the entire buffer every time I press a key. Now, since it's only been a few seconds, if I press H, you should see G under H. And I pressed it too late. So let me do it again. I'm going to press G, you should see H. There you go. So the H key was not removed from the buffer. Now I only pressed G there. So now, I'll give it a few seconds. It's going to kind of wipe everything out. But I'll be pressing a few keys. So I'm going to press Z, X, and C. All right next to each other on the keyboard. Z, X, and C. So there you go. Those are what's in my buffer right now. Now if I press N, you should see all of those. And now you should see a G on top of all those. And you can see it's been 10 seconds since I pressed the Z. So you can see they're starting to fade away as I press them. Not because I'm pressing other keys, but because time is running out for them to remain in the buffer. So if I were to press a bunch, well, now I can't track it, right? So that's why we need to be able to visualize it with pictures. But don't worry about that now. We're just worrying about the fact that we can actually get these things tracking properly, which we can. So that long intro is basically to say we're going to be tracking our inputs today and being able to display them in a very rudimentary manner. Just seeing them being printed to the screen, and it's as simple as that. Now, we're going to get started with the code today. If you have not watched any part of this series yet, or you're not fully caught up, I will leave a link in the iCard in the top right corner here to the very first tutorial episode of this series. Otherwise, let's get started. We are 33 episodes in, 33 episodes in, so there is a lot that we've done since the beginning. Okay, so for input buffers, we're going to need several things. First of all, we're going to need a way to determine what an input is, and also what we need to track from the input. So right off the bat, we need to know what button was pressed, or what key was pressed, or whatever. It can be also like the joystick was moved, and we'll need to grab the value potentially. For now, we're not going to do that because we're just focusing on the keyboard, but we will also cover like grabbing the specific value of the axis as well. So we'll be able to do quarter circle and things like that. So don't worry. But just as far as buttons go, we need to determine what button is pressed. We need to determine when it was pressed, and we need to determine if we want to add it to the buffer or remove it from the buffer. So we only add it essentially if it's a button we want. Again, right now I have any key being added, but you might not want to support certain things. Like if you're on a keyboard, maybe you don't want escape to be pressed because escape will close the window or something. So you can just ignore certain buttons and choose the ones you want. So that's when we know we want to add it if the button has been given to us, and we want to remove it after a certain amount of time. Simple enough. In your header file for your fighter template character, and I'd recommend putting it in here because each fighter is going to have one, both you and your enemy. Whether they're AI or not, even if it's simulated, you can actually still use an input buffer. So, okay. What I'm going to do is make a struct here, a U struct. Now, I don't think we've actually done that for this series. We might have done it in the hitbox, but I think we just did an enum. So a struct is basically a class. Honestly, it's really not much different. It's not even really worth going into the differences here in this episode, because for the purposes of this, it's pretty much the exact same. But this is a class, right? Our entire fighter template character. This is fighter template character class. A structure is basically a class, but you can make these inside of your other classes, right? So I can make this structure inside of my fighter template character. And this is going to be what we use as inputs. So they have the name of the input and the timestamp of the input. So go ahead and follow this method here. You use ustruct blueprint type, which just allows it to be able to be used or set as a type in Blueprint. Generated body is just something you need. It comes automatically when you make the structure. At least it does for me. I'm not sure if that does for everybody. So if you don't end up seeing it, or for whatever reason, go ahead and just add that there. Notice it doesn't have a semicolon or anything at the end of it. And then as variables here, and make sure you put public, just so you can see them in Blueprint. I have basically a Blueprint read-write for the input name and the timestamp, like I said. So the input name is an F string, which is just Unreal's version of string. And the timestamp is just a float, because we're just going to actually get the time in seconds that have passed. We can do frame conversions later and things like that. Right now we're just worried about when the input was pressed. Now that we have that, we want to go down and add two functions to our list. So you can see them right here. I'm adding a function called add input to input buffer, and a function called remove input from input buffer. Being very explicit here, so we know exactly what we're dealing with. I made them both Blueprint callable, although they probably don't need to be. Add input to input buffer is a good one to have as Blueprint callable for sure, and we'll actually be using that in today's episode. Remove input from input buffer, we're not actually going to fill out today. You'll see why, but we are going to use it later, so I'd recommend just making it now to make our lives easy. I will mention it again when we actually fill it out. Okay, and then good thing to note here, the add input to input buffer takes in an f input info, and I just called it input info. This f input info is the structure we made just above. So it takes in this structure as a parameter. There's two more things we need to make. One of them is the input buffer array. So the input buffer is basically, this is what contains everything. This is going to be our actual input buffer. The name actually lines up here. So this is going to be an array, T-array, of these structures. So this is going to have all the inputs that are currently valid or currently in that list before we remove them. Okay. And lastly, I went ahead and added a timer handle with a corresponding time. So just like we did the stun timer handle, if you remember that, the F timer handle is just Unreal's version of setting up setting up a timer. So go ahead and make one of these, input buffer timer handle, I called it, and you need the time that you want before the timer activates and calls the function, right? So I called that remove input from buffer time, which is the same as stun time. Again, we're not actually going to be using this today. I'll show you why when we get into it, but I'd recommend putting it in now just so you don't have to worry about it later. And that's all you need for the header file. You can see everything else is the same. Let's go into our C++ file. I'll scroll up to the top. You might want to set your times here. So, for example, remove input from buffer time. I set to be 1, so 1 second. That's probably too short. I think they usually stay a little bit longer than that, but I'm not entirely sure. Also, it doesn't really matter because once an input is no longer part of a sequence that is going to be read by the computer, it's not really important. So, you'll be pressing your inputs within a series of frames, within a certain amount of frames to perform the action. 1 second is a long time. I mean, it's 60 frames if you're running at 60 FPS. So you probably won't need to keep these for more than 1 second, but especially for the practice mode and when you want to visualize them, you probably don't want to get rid of them every second. I mean, it depends on what you're going for. So, but I kept it at 1 second. Okay, you don't have to do anything with your timer handles, so don't worry about that. Now, here's something I want to go over that we're not actually going to do today. This will be for probably next episode, but definitely before we're done with the input buffer episodes. So I went ahead and I added an input binding. And I added it to the any key functionality. Now this is fine, but this will actually capture inputs for your entire keyboard. Again, okay. However, when we're doing this, you would want to actually determine if you're player 1 or player 2. Because otherwise, great, we activated the sequence. Now both characters can go ahead and do that move. So that's why we have to actually figure this out for next episode and just determine who's doing what work. But for now, just to make sure we can do this correctly, because that's what's most important, if you go to Edit Project Settings, go to Input, go ahead and add a new action mapping. You can go ahead and hit plus and add to input buffer. Now for the record, we will be doing something similar with the axis mappings to grab the value, because axis mappings have the scale. And that's how we'll know what direction they are. Like for example, for quarter circle and stuff, that's something we'll get done in this small mini series within the fighting game tutorial series. We'll have to use the scale there. So don't worry, we're going to get into that. For now, let's just focus on the buttons. So add to input buffer is what I called it, and I put it as any key. Again, if you know all the keys you want to use in your game, you'd probably actually not want to set this at all. And you could set it to whatever, but what you'd actually want to do is not set it to a specific key. You'd want to set it to whatever these buttons all are. So if you were to remap these buttons, like attack 1, P1 is G. If I were to reset this and make this a different key, this should also reset. Does that make sense? This should actually rely on these attacks. Otherwise, we don't know if we have one input device, if it's player 1 or player 2. And since we're supporting a game where 2 people can play on the keyboard or one device, like an arcade cabinet, then it's important that we keep that in mind. That's why this any key is bad. But don't worry, we're going to be going over it. I just didn't want to stuff it into today's episode. So for now, feel free to use any key like I am. And what this means is literally anytime I press any key this would fire right here. Now, it's commented out for the reason above and what I've already explained. Their inputs are not filtered to just player 1 or player 2, so we don't actually want to add this and bind this action. Otherwise, we're going to get a bunch of additional inputs we don't want. But that's how we will set it up. Now, what we need to do is go down to the functions that we wrote in the header file, and I'll show you how those work. So add input to input buffer that takes in the f input info. It's pretty simple. Our input buffer, all we need to do is add the input info structure that is being passed into this function. So every time we press a key, the blueprint is going to pick up what the key was. It's going to pass in the key and the timestamp to this function in a structure format, and then we're going to add that structure to the input buffer. Then in Blueprint, we will also remove items from the input buffer. So whatever's in this input buffer at the current time are the inputs that you will see on the screen. It's also the inputs that we parsed for the correct sequence to perform special attacks and such. Simple enough. Now, this timer, I left this in on purpose. So you could use a timer to remove inputs from your input buffer. And that sounds like a pretty good idea, right? The problem is if you use Unreal's default timer, you have to set up a lot to make it work correctly for this. So timers are great, but if you have the ability to enter the timer more than once, so for example, if I were to set a timer to remove the input every 10 seconds or every 1 second, like in this case, here's the variable that we made 1 second, here's the handle, and I pressed 30 inputs in that 1 second. Now, you know, say you did that. Say you pressed that many. Well, the timer can actually only do one operation at a time. So the 29 other inputs would actually be worthless to this timer. It would set the timer, and then it would just do that action, wait to call this function, because that's what this part is. This is the function that will be called once this timer amount has been reached. So after a second pass, it would call this function. Great. But if I press 30 inputs, it would only do this one time. So you would miss removing 29 inputs from the input buffer. Well, we don't want that. That is terrible, and it would leave so much data in there, and it would become huge and would be just, yeah, terrible. We can get around this several different ways, but I wanted to keep this in here. You can still use a timer, so if you're interested in using timers, don't give up hope, but just be aware of this flaw. You will have an issue with this if you try and use it just like this, just like we use our other timer. And then I went ahead and wrote remove input from input buffer, but I'm not going to add anything to it yet. Again, it'll make more sense in the next episode why I haven't, but there's the function. Okay, so essentially after defining everything in the header file, all we've actually done is wrote the two functions and have this input buffer.add. Easy. Now what we need to do is go into our blueprint and figure out the rest of the logic. So I'm doing this in my mutant character BP. This should be your default character blueprint. So whatever that is. For me, you know, I should have named it better because I had the fighter template blueprint and I'm like, yeah, I'll be using that. But because I didn't have animations for the mannequin, I didn't really feel like rigging him or like learning to auto rig him in Mixamo. I did not use that one. So my mutant character BP is like my default character BP. So whatever the one is that you're going to make the parent of all your other character BPs, this is where you'll want to do this, because you only need to do this once. You only need to do it in the parent class, and the rest can just work. The only thing that'll be different between them that will override in the child classes is the sequences we look for. It has to be relating to their moveset. Okay, what we're going to do is, in our character BP, we can look for an input action. So we can go ahead and type in add to input buffer. This is the thing that I set to be any key in the edit project settings input section. So once you click that, you'll have this input action add to input buffer. Now, this will fire when any key is pressed, and it also gives you the key that was actually pressed. So what we can do is drag off of the key, type get key display name, because we just need the name, right? At the end of the day, we just need the name. If you pass the whole key around and store it in the array, you're actually going to have more data than if you were to just use the name and the timestamp. You can also save out pressed and released if you want, and it would still be shorter than having the whole key structure. So my point here is we're just going to save the name. We don't really care what the actual key was. Just as long as the name matches, we are good. Okay, so grab the key, get the display name, and then you don't have to do this cast here. I'll do it automatically. But now we're going to call our add input to input buffer, which is our code function here. So make sure you build solution and then compiled right here. And then you should be able to access your function that we wrote, add input to input buffer right here. And that's this guy. Now, he will actually have a struct by default, so here, let me actually put him up for you. He'll look like this, input info. Now, you could either drag off of input info and hit make input info, and then fill out his data. You can also just right-click on the structure, hit split struct pin, and then just fill out the data individually. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you prefer, they do the same thing. So go ahead and just drag in from get key display name. It'll automatically do the cast for you from text to string. And then go ahead and type in get time seconds. And then go ahead and drag that into your timestamp. Okay, now I'm going to delete this one since we already have it right up above, but that's how that works. Then, what we're doing here is we're going to remove all the inputs from the input buffer that are too old. This is pretty much exactly how we're going to keep this functionality. There will be a few changes to it, or not really changes, additions to it, and it might actually go into the code class where we wrote our function for, removing inputs. That would be good. But the reason it's in here now, and the reason I'm like, oh, I'm not filling this function out today, is because if we are to do this in the code class right now, it won't actually get us the functionality that we need later on. I'm going to be using this input buffer array that we have here exposed in Blueprint to get our symbols for the practice mode when we want to show it. I want it to pass through Blueprint for a specific reason that I don't need to go into today because it's just going to sound confusing if I talk about it. So for now, I'm going to just leave the logic to remove inputs from the input buffer in Blueprint. If you want to do that, you can actually keep it this way, and I don't think it would cause any issues at all. I don't think you need to switch it and bring it to the code class at all. So feel free to keep it this way. If you want to have all your input buffer stuff done in code, other than the images, then feel free to play around with it, or I'll show you what I'm thinking in, the next few episodes. But I want to bring attention to that. There's not one way to do anything. There's in coding, there's plenty of different ways, so feel free to play around with it. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to grab our input buffer. This is what has all of our inputs that are still relevant. We're going to loop through them. So if we have A, B, and C in our input buffer, let's say that. We're going to break the element. So literally, you just type break input info. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the new time in seconds. And look at what this is. Returns time in seconds since world was brought up for play, adjusted by time dilation, and is stopped when game pauses. This is perfect, and this is what we want. We only want items to be removed from the input buffer if they're a certain amount of seconds old or frames old, depending on how you want to set it up. And any sort of hit stop or time stop that we do, we don't want to affect that. And if the game is paused, we don't want to affect that. So this is excellent. Get time seconds is exactly what we want. Now, I exaggerated for the sake of the video. So 10 seconds is huge, and you almost definitely don't want it this big. But what's going on here is remember we used get time seconds to set the timestamp for the input. We're going to get the new time in seconds at this point and subtract 10 from it. If that is still greater than any of the inputs in this array, we want to remove them from the array, because that means the current time minus 10, so 10 seconds ago, there's inputs that are older than 10 seconds still in this array. So we don't want that. So the way I'm doing it is I'm taking the timestamp from the array element and checking if it's less than get time seconds minus 10. Same thing. If it's true, it is less than it, then we want to remove that element from the array. And you can see I'm bringing it around here. So literally drag off your array element and type remove. And you can do remove item. This is the correct one, not just remove, but it just says remove. So don't get confused. If you drag off of this, you want remove item. Okay. Then you don't have to do anything more with this. You actually don't even have to do this next part, but this is how you can visualize it and test and make sure it's working, so it's pretty important. So once this is completed and all the old ones have been removed, drag off and completed, and I have a little comment here, showcase what elements are in the input buffer, and that's exactly what we're doing. You can also print the timestamps out here, which I'm not doing because it gets very ugly very quickly. But if you use the input buffer and loop again, and remember, this won't be, this won't be hooked up at runtime or during the final product, so it's okay to keep this nasty. Like, it's okay if we're looping a second time when we were just looping before. It's okay if the code's not even that, or the blueprint is not even that neat or anything. It doesn't matter. This is for debugging, for our testing purposes. It won't remain hooked up. So I'm just bringing that up because I know some people will probably say, well, why are you looping again if you're looping right here? Good point, but I just didn't want to add this here because I wanted to separate it, and we're not going to use it, so it's not actually going to hurt us. Grab the input buffer, loop through it, break it again, and then go ahead and drag off the input name and type print string. Once you do that, just make sure you hook up your code flow, and you will be good to go. It will print the name of your key that was pressed to the screen. And then you can go ahead and drag off timestamp, and we'll type in print string first, like you have here, and then drag off your timestamp. It'll automatically convert for you if you want to see the times. There you go. And you are good to go at that point. You should be able to now press a button. It should be added to your input buffer. Then, after 10 seconds have passed, they will be removed from the buffer. And then everything will be printed to the screen that's still in the buffer. Now, it's important to note, this input action, remember, fires off any key. So buttons will only be removed from the input buffer once you press a key and they're 10 seconds old. So yeah, you'll see some weirdness, right, where you're like, well, these are still in the array even though they're older than 10 seconds. Is that okay? I mean, honestly, in my opinion, I think it is okay because this would only be an issue if things weren't being removed from the input buffer and you were pressing a lot of keys. However, if you're actually pressing a lot of keys, then this functionality is going to be firing to remove it from the array. So it's not really a problem. What you'll want to do is make sure they are hidden after a certain amount of time, if nothing else. So that way, you know, it doesn't get super ugly and just sit on the screen forever. But maybe you actually want that because maybe you want people to see what they've pressed, even if it's not still in the input buffer. So there you go. But I just want to bring awareness to that. I'm aware that this is happening. If you wanted it to happen every 10 seconds, I mean, you could throw this on tick. Just so you know, be careful. If you access any array and add or remove an element during runtime, or during runtime, but while another operation could occur. So for example, if you have this in tick, you'll probably get a crash if you're still doing this. Just because you're removing elements while something else is trying to read elements from that same array. And the computer does not like that. So be careful if you do that, but feel free to do it if you're up for the task. Just make sure you're doing it safely. However, I'd recommend doing this anyway. I think it's actually just going to save on processing power. And it's not really going to affect your game at all. You're going to know internally that the inputs have not gone away, but I don't think that really hurts anything. Okay, guys, so there you go. That's everything I can think of for today's episode of input buffers. I'll load this up one more time. But now we can actually check this list for a specific sequence and perform an action. So in next episode, just to outline it, we are going to go over assigning the keys that we're using, not to any key, but actually to the keys that are relevant to player 1. Any keys or buttons on a controller that player 1 can press and perform an action. And we'll also add the axis mappings in there, because now that we've done the action mappings, it's pretty much the exact same thing, except we're going to use the scale. And then with that, we will be able to check sequences. So, there you go, guys. I think that's it. I'll stop rambling now, but I'm Shawnthebro. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, please subscribe. Helps me more than anything else you can do. And we are not stopping this series anytime soon, so you'll have plenty of content to watch in the future. Thank you again, Shadow Magnus, my friend Pedro, for the amazing help with the stage here. It looks incredible. The game looks so much better with it. Thank you so much. Also, guys, if you had any issues with this episode, because this was a bit of a weird one, I try to keep them a little bit more, you know, everything cut and dry, but it's hard to kind of show you what the array has in it in a way that makes sense without printing it out, as ugly as the print string does print it out. So don't worry, in the next episode it'll look a lot nicer, because you'll be able to see it a lot more clearly, and it won't take just any input. But just be aware of that. If you did have any issues, feel free to join the Discord. I can't put it in the iCard, but you can go ahead and look in the description. Right next to Discord, you'll see a link. Click it. You'll be in the server, and you know we have plenty of people who would be happy to help you get situated and fix up whatever issues you had. Lastly, guys, if you want to come support us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. We played Souls Wednesday, so Dark Souls games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro on Wednesday, and Resident Evil games or just scary games in general on Friday. If you'd like to come support us, give us some love, I'd love to have you, and just hang out with us for a few hours. 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just so you're aware. Alright, guys. That is officially it for me, so once again, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye, guys.